Hey y'all, I'm Julia Craven, and today I'm chatting with Errin Haines, editor at large for The 19th, a new nonprofit newsroom that is focused on women and politics. And I'm so happy that you could join us for this installment of Conversations with Julia Craven for a discussion on Black women and the 2020 election. Next week, I'll be back to talk to somebody else who is also making strides in their respective fields. But today, me and Errin are going to dig into the most influential voting bloc in the country. So, how are you doing today?
Julia, I'm great. How are you? Happy Monday.
Ooh, are Mondays happy?
They are when we're talking about Black women and their role in the American electorate.
Well, and that's that on that. So let's get started. So let's just give people a rundown. People who may not be familiar with Black women as a voting bloc. How influential is this demographic when we're talking about elections?
Yeah, so Black women are really, and I think you know I've reported this many times. My dog is going to join this chat apparently. Um, Black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party, right? I mean, they're not just
Hmm.
voters, and when they go to the polls, they don't just go for themselves. They go for their family, they go for their community, they go for the race, they go for the country, right? And they don't just take
Right.
themselves to the polls. They take their sorority, they take their church members, they take their community, they take their family, loved ones, friends. It's not just something that they do for themselves, and so that really is the difference between like the Black woman voter and the rest of the American electorate. That they really do vote with everyone in mind, and so we know that at least for the past several cycles, that Black women have turned out in excess of 60% at every election, outpacing their percentage of the population. Black women are only about 7% of the U.S. population. And, in 2016, Black women voted for Hillary Clinton more than any other group. 94% of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton. And
Right.
so, Black women, when they show up at the polls, they don't just show up, they show out. And this is the reason that they are such a valuable part of our politics.
And so, what issues would you say that Black women voters care about the most? Because you've been covering race and ethnicity for quite some time, and your work has always centered on us and how we feel about politics, what we care about, what is most pressing to us. So, what would you say in this election is most important to Black women voters?
I think the priority for Black women this year is what it is most years, which is that racism is on the ballot. Addressing systemic racism, as it affects not only them but their families and the Black community is a priority for Black women. Right? Obviously, we are
Right.
in a national moment of reckoning around race. Where a lot of the country is waking up to what Black women have long known and tried to tell the rest of the country about. And that's in every aspect of our society. Black women, like a lot of Americans, prioritize things like healthcare or the economy or education, but have a very specific lens in terms of the intersection of race and gender that puts them at the bottom of the totem pole in so many of those areas. And so when you fix these things for Black women, you really fix them for the entire American society, which is why they push so hard for these things, not just for themselves, but because they know that it will improve the country and our democracy in general.
All right, that reminds me of I've interviewed several politicians where when I ask them about their platforms and how they read to me as very race centric, they always say that, well, when you start uplifting Black people, you're going to bring everybody else with you because you're targeting the folks who are being the most disenfranchised in this country.
Right. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
mean, policies that exclude Black people and particularly Black women um, do not tend to be helpful for everyone. But when you govern with Black people and Black women in mind, that the residual effect that is the rising tide that lifts all boats. In many cases, when you have Black women thinking about how to govern, how to shape, how our society will function and for whom. right? I think that is how you
Right.
get to addressing a lot of the institutional and systemic problems that exist in this country and that people are taking to the streets for right now.
Right. So let's get into that because there's a lot going on right now. There are massive
A whole lot,
there's
a
so much
whole lot.
going on. And so we have the protest against racism, and I call them protests against systemic racism because even though they were the impetus was George Floyd's death. I mean, they've just become so much bigger than this one issue. They've always been bigger than one issue. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so I want to hop into the pandemic piece of this first. How has coronavirus affected voting?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like this moment is about the intersection of everything. And I think, what the pandemic did was that it exposed inequality in every aspect of our society. Policing was just the latest iteration of that and kind of the final straw for a lot of people that forced them into the streets. But, you know, the pandemic is political for people. It absolutely is, and it's occurring in the midst of our primary elections. And you saw people literally willing to risk their public health for the health of our democracy, standing in hours-long lines, trying to social distance as best they could at precincts. But the pandemic meant that most of the older poll workers who would typically be manning those precincts were not able to do that because of safety concerns around coronavirus. And so you have fewer precincts, which meant, people standing in line for longer and really just wondering if and how they could cast a ballot safely in this democracy. And that really applied to African American voters in particular, because what we know is that black and brown voters black and brown people in this country are being disproportionately impacted by this virus. They're contracting it and being killed by it more than white Americans. And so, I think in so many ways, these dual pandemics have really laid bare, um, who and where we are as a country, and that there has to be a new normal, not just around coronavirus for a lot of people, but also around the way that races live in America.
Right. I remember early on in the pandemic when I believe it was Wisconsin was voting. They weren't
Mm-hmm.
the only state that had a primary, but I remember particularly there was some pushback there about closing the polls or postponing these elections until it was safer, until we had a better idea of how people could safely cast ballots. And so when how has that affected black voters in particular? Because when I think about Wisconsin, I'm thinking about Milwaukee.
Yeah, absolutely. Milwaukee, which is the blackest part of Wisconsin, right? But
Right.
you also saw people. You also saw similar concerns in Georgia, right? Where
Yes.
mail-in balloting was way up this year, particularly because black folks were concerned about the thought of standing in a line. But you saw black and many white folks for the first time, frankly, understanding what voter disenfranchisement might look like, right? Having to stand in line for 3 or 4 hours. That was a new experience for
Right.
them. Me, black folks showing up with snacks, folding chairs, cell phone chargers, you name it, right? Because they knew that they were going to
Yes.
be in line for a long time. They had a survival kit when they hit the polls. Kentucky, same situation. You had Louisville, right? Tons of black people
Mhm.
trying to safely cast their ballot. And going to the polls with a Breonna Taylor in mind when they went to
Yes.
vote. We're more than 100 days out, and her killers have not been charged or arrested, right? Like that is a thing that is motivating
Right.
them, despite the fact that coronavirus is in full force in this country and is in fact making a comeback, right, this summer. So, yeah, I mean, I think um, for the black voters who see racism as a public health issue, right? Like it is absolutely on
Right.
par for many of us with coronavirus. And that is why I think you see a lot of people taking to the streets. And that is why you see a lot of people, um, frankly, willing to risk standing at a polling place to make their voice heard this cycle.
Right. Absolutely. Because I believe my parents, they live in Georgia. I think they did mail in ballots, but I don't know what Nana did.
Well, I
So
tell you,
I
I mean,
was a little concerned about her.
my mom voted mail in, and my mom is a super voter. Okay, my mom votes in every election, doesn't matter who's running. She votes every single time, and I
Yes.
was terrified at the thought of my mom standing in a precinct, trying to cast a ballot, even with a mask on, even with gloves, even with sanitizer, like all of those things, the precautions that I know she is taking in other aspects of her daily life. I didn't want her at a precinct, potentially being exposed to people. But much to my relief, she told me that she'd gotten her mail-in ballot, she'd voted by mail. But really, I mean, that's the first time that my mom has done that. My mom usually is.
Um, could you repeat what you said? The sirens that just blew past my
Oh
house
my gosh, the black
drowned you
Julia.
out. So I'm so sorry.
No, it's totally fine. There's a lot going on. Now, what I was saying was that my super voter mother voted by mail for the first time, and she is somebody who usually is that person who wants to see her ballot be cast in person. She usually early votes because obviously that's the thing in Georgia. You have weeks of early voting that you can do, but she wanted no parts of her precinct, much to my relief, because she is somebody who's taking precautions, and I would hate for her to contract coronavirus trying to participate safely in this democracy. So I think a lot of Black folks are open, maybe even for the first time, in areas of the country that have had historic disenfranchisement, are open to the idea of mail-in balloting for the first time, even as the president is raising kind of the specter of voter fraud and rigged elections through a mail-in balloting process.
Right. And how dangerous is that? I mean, a lot of things that the president says are very, very dangerous. But when we are talking about mail in ballots, especially right now, how dangerous is this narrative that he's pushing?
Well, I mean, it's a form of voter suppression. I mean, like we know that he's not somebody who has shown a particular concern for voter integrity or voter access, right?
Right.
But he has talked about voter fraud, particularly in cities and urban areas, right? 2016, he was raising the specter of possibly rigged elections in cities like Philadelphia, where I live, where there are a lot of Black folks that cast ballots, right? And so, that is, I don't even know if it's still a dog whistle, Julie. It might just be a people whistle at this point. To
Yeah.
folks,
It's a bullhorn.
when you say things like, oh well, I suspect voter fraud might be afoot. I mean, there's no proof that there's widespread voter fraud with absentee or mail-in balloting in America. So,
Right.
kind of creating that that's myth making. It's not real, and people, what you would want to hear from a president is how what his plan is for how as many Americans as possible are going to be able to vote safely and participate fully in our democracy. Okay, Ginger. Ginger also is not down with voter suppression, just so y'all
I see. She's very passionate. She has a lot of feelings.
know.
Um, and so now let's get into the protest. And so one thing that you said a little bit earlier was you mentioned that the officers who killed Breonna Taylor have not been arrested or charged or disciplined outside of losing their jobs at this point. And so I wanted to link back to that and ask you, what do Black people have explain the understanding that Black folks have of how local elections, state elections, these smaller scale elections that don't get as much media attention can have the most change within a community? Because, for example, when we're talking about arresting cops, we're talking about who your district attorney is, we're talking about who your state's attorney is, we're talking about who your attorney general is.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that Black people have increasingly been making that connection, especially since 2014 when the Black Lives Matter era was kind of born. A lot more attention on district attorneys since then. You've got Kim Foxx in Chicago, who was swept in, on a reform message. You've got Larry Krasner here in Philadelphia. Okay, Ginger, down with district attorneys. Also saying that he was running. I mean, he was a former um, defense attorney who ran for DA of Philadelphia because he was running on a Black Lives Matter message. You also have in the midst of this pandemic, you had the first Black woman mayor of Ferguson ever elected. Ferguson, the birthplace of the modern Black Lives Matter era movement. And they're just now for the 6 years later getting a Black woman in charge of running that city. So I think that people are beginning to make those connections and paying a lot more attention to the offices that will have an impact on their everyday lives a lot more. And so I think that you're going to see people paying attention not just to, I think, what is the most consequential presidential election that we have seen in our lifetimes, but I think also a lot of those down ticket races to see who is running in their communities and how those people will also govern with their health and safety in mind.
And so, have you, throughout in your reporting, have you come across people who intend to cast ballots, or maybe who don't intend to cast ballots? But either way, have you come across people where their decision on what they're going to do in November is attached to our current, well, it's not a new narrative, but it has entered in the mainstream about police abolition and just uprooting the system entirely because to date, the reforms instituted haven't worked as well as people thought they would.
Well, what I will say is that what I hear from um, a lot of the Black voters that I have been talking to throughout the primary and heading into November is that what they are doing in November is that they're casting a survival vote. And that was true even before
Yeah.
the pandemic, and it's even more true now, right? Like this is
Yeah.
some of them not even about a particular candidate. Like this is, except for Donald Trump, who they are singularly focused on getting rid of in November. Like that is what a lot of Democrats, especially Black voters, have told me is their number one priority. It's why they were able to say, look, maybe Joe Biden wasn't my candidate. There were 20 something people running in the Democratic primary. Maybe I wanted somebody else, but if it's Joe Biden against Donald Trump, then okay, that's what we're doing. Um, and they say that that is about their survival because they worry about their health and safety under a second term of President Donald Trump.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that Black voters just in general vote out of a place of harm reduction. Which
Absolutely.
candidate is going to cause the least harm to me and my people?
Yeah.
Um,
We talk about enthusiasm. And I think enthusiasm matters for sure. I mean, you want um,
right.
have because that is what it's going to take to beat an incumbent. Period. But this president in particular, if that's what Democrats plan to do, they're going to have enthusiasm and they have to galvanize people. But um, but I think that Black folks have not. It is a privilege to be able to cast a ballot for many Black people in America for somebody that they are excited about, right? The reason
Yes.
that we saw record turnout in 2008 and 2012 is because Black people were excited about Barack Obama, like very excited. Obviously historic nature of his campaign in 2008, but also wanting to see him reelected in 2012 was something that was exciting for Black people. Black people don't have that experience in most presidential cycles and most elections that they cast a ballot in, but they show up anyway.
Right. It's like in 2016 when Hillary got the nomination, it was, I'm with her, I guess. Like that was the prevailing narrative on Twitter. Like, I guess I'm with her, even though I
But
don't necessarily
but
want to be.
but they were and like I said, 94% of Black women showed up, right?
Right.
And on the other side of that, you had white voters who, if she was somebody who did not excite them, either voted for Donald Trump or stayed home. Like that's not the calculation that Black people make at the polls.
Right. Absolutely. And so now let's get into Biden. I have so many questions about him because I do think he's quite a fascinating character, truthfully. Um, and so there's a lot of online critique about Joe Biden, tons of it. And so I'm wondering how the online slash Twitter narratives that we get about Biden, how that squares with what you hear from people in your reporting.
Well, like I tell people all the time, and I have to remind myself of this, so I say it for myself as much as I do for anybody that I say it to. Twitter's not America. It's not. It is a great place for civil discourse. It is fodder for story ideas for sure. And I've met many people on Twitter that I can interview, but Twitter is not America. And that was no more real for me than when I was out on the campaign trail. Remember the campaign trail, Julia? That was so long ago. But yeah, being out on the campaign trail, being out on the campaign trail and actually talking to voters. Most of them are not in that echo chamber on social media, right? They, especially in those early primary states where voters were just kind of locked in and really focused on trying to discern which of the candidates of the very crowded field we had this year was going to be best positioned to beat Donald Trump. Um, so they were listening to candidates and were trying to understand what policies these candidates had. And with Joe Biden in particular, what I would hear from voters over and over again was not about Hunter Biden, was not about Ukraine, was not about his languishing campaign. It was, well, I feel like Joe Biden knows me, and I feel like I know him. Because this man has been in politics for half a century. I mean, so this is something that predates even Barack Obama and that bromance that people are familiar with. And that is something that is a thing for people, his loyalty to Barack Obama, especially for Black folks. Like that is a thing for some Black folks. But even beyond that, like he's been around for so long. Now, some of the things that are discussed on Twitter were things that I did here on the campaign trail. I mean, there certainly are Black voters and Black women and women in general who are concerned about Anita Hill. They feel like that's unresolved, right?
Yeah.
And this kind of reckoning around gender as well. I think that's the thing that people want to hear from him on. But it's interesting because you have Joe Biden, and then you have President Trump, who has been accused of sexual assault by dozens of women, and so that is the issue of gender and women's safety in America. I think is an issue in this election period, and not just unique to either one of the candidates, right? But yeah, I think for all of the conversation on Twitter about Joe Biden's problems, about his electability, about how he was stalling, like I'm telling you, the Black voters that I talked to, and I will be honest, I was mainly focused. I went to Iowa and New Hampshire, but I knew that this race was not real until we got to South Carolina, because until Black people weigh in, like, what are we even talking about?
Right.
Like the base of
Exactly.
the party had not had a say, right? And so if Black people
Right.
were unwavering in their support of Joe Biden in poll after poll after poll after poll for months, Joe Biden is your nominee.
Right. I remember early on telling my colleagues in a Slack that Biden was going to be the nominee, and they were so optimistic that I was not right. And I'm just, I'm not gonna get into the particulars about who certain people preferred, but I was just like, y'all, Biden is going to be the nominee.
Listen, I mean, honestly, the only poll number that I was looking at during the primary was where Black voters were, because I knew that
Right.
whoever, like, the path to the nomination went through Black voters, period. And by Black voters, I mean Black women, because Black women are the majority of Black voters, right?
Right.
So, like, I knew that whoever Black people, and especially Black women, not who they liked necessarily, they liked several people, right? But when you ask them straight up, who do you think who is the person, not just the person that you think can beat Donald Trump, but who is the person that you think most white people are going to vote for in America? Because that's the real question. Like when
Right.
we say that Black voters are pragmatic, their pragmatism is rooted in Who can we get behind that y'all are going to get behind so that we can win? Because black people, just like in 2016, had Hillary Clinton won, black people would have helped to make that happen. But black people are not the reason that Hillary Clinton lost. This year, Joe Biden cannot win without black people. But if he loses, it will not be because of black people.
Right. No, that makes sense. And black voters, particularly black women, we're just out here making lemonade out of this whole thing. I don't know how else to describe it. Because when we think about gender and we think about his gaffes and just so many gaffes from Biden, so many. I don't even know where to start, truthfully. But I mean, yeah, we tend to have limited options, and so
But is the president of the United States not gaffe prone? Does he not make gaffes?
no, which one? The current one?
Yeah.
Oh,
Like focusing on
I mean, I don't know. Are those?
it's focusing on like is that disqualifying for Democrats?
No, 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 no. And that's not my point. My point is that Biden is the Democrat, and it has been the most prominent choice for the nomination for quite some time. So I was just talking about his gaffes, and frankly, I get a little bit tired of thinking about Trump's. So maybe I have unfairly been focusing on Biden because I get so tired of the Trump gaffes. Um, and so now his search for vice president, or his vice presidential nominee. What are you hearing from people about that?
Well, listen, deep stakes is pretty much all that we political journalists have to focus on for the next 3 weeks. It's pretty much been the main story to the extent that there was a story about the campaign since the pandemic. Joe Biden pledged to pick a woman. Um, as it became more and more clear that he was going to be the nominee, and that none of the 6 women who ran for president this year were um, anyone that the American electorate wanted to see as their nominee, right? And it's hugely
Right,
important. It's hugely important because, for as much as we make about the fact that there's never been a woman president, there's never been a woman vice president in the history of the United States, right? So
right,
that's one thing. The second thing is, given everything that this country is dealing with, the dual pandemics that are raging and that are not likely to go anywhere anytime soon, um, this is probably the most consequential vice presidential pick in our lifetimes, in terms of what that person is going to be tasked with. I mean, that woman is literally going to be trying to help this president fix America,
right,
in a number of ways, right? So who that person is and how they will govern, um, and frankly, given Joe Biden's age, like we have to care about who this person is more than we normally would care about who the
right.
vice president of the United States is, right? And
Exactly.
so, um, I think amid the amid the national reckoning, the chorus has grown louder for him to pick a black woman. Period. Um, I think that the black women voters that I talk to say, and not just for symbolic reasons, because obviously it would be hugely symbolic, but also because what black women bring to leading and governing is something that they feel the country needs in this moment. Like black women have been the caretakers of this democracy since we were enslaved, even before we could vote, even before we were free. This has been our role in America, right? And our vote is an extension of
Right.
that, and our leadership is an extension of that. And so, when you think about it that way, having a black woman on the ticket um, is not just about diversity or balance, right? But it is a politically astute decision for the direction that
Yes.
the party says that it wants to take the country, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, I think you hear, I mean, the names that everybody else has out there, I think are real. Senator Harris has certainly been at or near the top of that list, even as the criteria have kind of shifted in the past several months. But Elizabeth Warren, if there's going to be a white woman, um, that is the white woman that most black women voters tell me they are most open to. And she has been polling. I mean, not that the voters get to pick the vice president, but when voters are asked who they would like to see as their vice president, Elizabeth Warren is at or near the top for many voters. And so I think that that means that she has to be in serious consideration, right? But this is a white woman who knows how to talk
Right.
about systemic racism and who did that as a presidential candidate. Val Demings, Congresswoman out of Florida, whose name has come up. She was already on the radar after the impeachment hearings, but as a former police chief in Orlando, she has been speaking to the need for police reform as somebody who, was a part of the system and had tried to change it. I think that she is somebody who is maybe not um, drawing attention to herself as much as maybe some of the other names on the list, but is on the list nonetheless. And I think is somebody that my understanding is that she has impressed Vice President Biden, um, and so she could be somebody who is named. Um, Susan Rice, who is not a politician. She's a policy person, but she of
Right.
every on that list, Susan Rice knows the vice president better than anybody. So they have. He's looking for somebody who he has a simpatico relationship with. Not only were they together in the Obama administration, but I mean they go all the way back to when he was in the Senate and she was in the State Department and he was in Foreign Affairs. So yeah, I mean the fact that there are numerous women of color, especially Black women, um, I think um, speaks well to a Black woman's chances for being chosen.
Mhm.
Um, it doesn't feel like that situation where employer is just interviewing a bunch of Black women for fun and then is going to pick a white woman in the end. You know what I mean?
Well, that's good to know.
It doesn't feel like that. But what do I know? This entire election cycle has been completely unpredictable, and so I don't even pretend that I can handicap the deep states or know what Vice President Biden is going to do because I do not. So I should also just offer that disclaimer.
Of course. And so you published a piece this morning, and the headline is "Black female voters say they want what they're owed: power." So tell me about this story. You talked to a lot of Black women who organize voters and do my words are failing me, but who do electoral work. And so tell me about this story. Yeah, I'm very interested to know what you got from people.
Yeah, I mean, so look, since 2016, I have been kind of hammering the theme that Black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party, right? That they are the and that they are the caretakers of our democracy. And I've written that in various forms and various stories. I've tried to show that in my reporting. But I think that pulling that together in one story that really just kind of asserted why that is, why that has been historically, and why that may finally yield um, results for Black women headed into this fall was a story that I felt like was timely and needed to be told now. So yeah, I mean, to think about this also, I mean, I work for a newsroom that is named for the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, obviously, giving the right to vote to white women, excluding other women for generations. Black women had to fight twice as hard for the vote and did not get that until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 really was passed. But they fought for it nonetheless. 100 years ago, they were there. They were on the front lines pushing for suffrage as well, even though they did not get it because they understood the power of the vote. And we've been organizing in ways formal and informal for the entirety of the time that we've been in this country, and we have uniquely understood the founding ideals of America, and we have really tried to force this country to reckon with making those ideals real for everyone. Um, I would say probably more than anybody. Um, like I mentioned earlier, I live in Philadelphia now. I'm from Atlanta, cradle of the civil rights movement, but I live in Philadelphia, cradle of democracy, right? And we just celebrated the 4th of July. Declaration of Independence was signed here. And, I think a lot about what it means to be a citizen in America right now, what it means to participate in this democracy, what it means to think about the idea that this country was founded on protest and dissent. And like who gets to protest and dissent is really about who gets to be American. And when the Declaration of Independence was being written, there was a lot of America was not literate, right? And so what would happen is that they would read the Declaration of Independence in town squares and in people's homes. And there was an enslaved woman, Elizabeth Freeman, who was in Massachusetts, and this was before the actual Declaration, but it was a predecessor to the Declaration. She hears basically the words of the Declaration of Independence being read in her in the home of the man who enslaved her, and immediately understood as a human being that those ideals applied to her. But of course, she was told no, they did not apply to her. She sued for her freedom and won. And her story is just, she is one of so many ancestors. From her story to Fannie Lou Hamer's story, like this is who Black women are, and this is what they do. And so wanting to lay that out for people was very important for me, but also just the idea that so many of the Black women who have been in this work for so long do feel like something is different about this year. And it's because of all the work that has come before. Like that work has gotten them to the point where they can now say, look, you don't just get to come to us 6 weeks out and say, help us get across the finish line, save us, right? You have to come to us from the beginning and ask us what we want. And then when we tell you what we want, you have to do what we say, right? Like you don't have a conversation about the very real possibility of a Black woman vice president without that being real. You don't have Joe Biden saying, I'm going to put a Black woman on the Supreme Court for the first time ever.
Right.
Like somebody who treated Anita Hill the way that she was treated. Like you don't have that without Black women pushing and pushing and forcing that conversation. You don't have defund the police without the Black women activists who are in the streets calling for this to happen in cities in America. Like that is who is driving that conversation. And so, Black women are, like the Black women I've talked to, it's a mix of disappointment that the diverse field of candidates has come down to 2 white men in their 70s, but it is also a hopeful moment that their priorities will finally be put into policy in this country.
Right. And so there's this quote in your piece from Dontoya Thomason, and it says, yeah, her quotes are great. She says, Black women lose sleep at night over injustice. I don't want 2020 to come and go, where we've raised all this hell, and for Joe Biden to get into office and we don't turn the heat up. I don't want him to feel like he can rest if he becomes president. And that got me to thinking about Black Women For and why they endorsed Elizabeth Warren, because they felt as though she was a president who would respond to pressure. And I think that right now we're in a moment where exactly what you said, Black women are just like, hey, we're like, it's pressure. Like, you don't get to just come through here and use us to get elected. Like, nah, what are you going to do when you get there? And how can we hold you accountable? And so what have you heard from people you've spoken with about holding whoever is in the White House accountable?
Yeah, I think, listen, Black women overwhelmingly rejected the president in 2016. There's no indication that things would be any different for him in 2020, right? So we're really talking about what is Joe Biden going to have to do for the Black women who made him the earliest Democratic nominee in recent primary history, and who could make him the next president of the United States, right? Um, and I think you see, like there is, there are Black women involved in this VP committee selection process. There are Black women in decision making and policy making decisions on his campaign. Uh, there are, Black women surrogates that he has across this country who are not only making the case for him, but are making the case to him about the priorities that they have should he be elected, right? Um, Healthcare, the economy, and racism are, even in some order, are the top three priorities for Black women repeatedly. Like, that's what we hear from over and over again. These are the things they care about. So if he is not going to address those things, he will be hearing from Black women should he get into office. They plan to. What they tell me is that they plan to hold him accountable. And it's interesting you brought up Elizabeth Warren, because they liked a lot of her ideas. They were open to a lot of what she had to say, but they also made her commit to a certain roster of things that they wanted to see, right? Like, should she have become the nominee, and should she have been elected? So, like, even, that was I think November, October or
Yeah,
November. Um, so,
late last year.
months before the primary even started, a year before the election, they were asking her to commit to doing certain things on behalf of Black folks. Which I think is really, I mean, that's where Black women are now. They're like, what are you going to do for us? And we want assurances of what you're going to do.
Right. Because we're always so tapped in. We know we have to keep track of everything. It's survival.
Well, and Black women, I
And
mean, Black women saw what was going on with this country long before right now, right?
right,
And tried to tell America what was going on with this country long before.
right. And so let's talk about your career, because you've been doing this work for quite some time, and you're someone whose work
Despite my
has
youthful
inspired the
appearance,
work. Wait, I'm
despite
sorry,
my
I didn't hear you.
despite my youthful appearance, that's true. I've been at this for a minute. That's true.
I mean, you don't look a day over 25, sis.
Accurate facts.
And so you're someone who has inspired the work of many Black women journalists after you, myself included. And so how have you seen the coverage of Black women and Black women voters change?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it is those of us who are in this work, uh, talented journalists like you, who I admire greatly, Maya King, who's doing this work, Brittany Shepard over at Yahoo. I mean, I could keep going, but there are Black women who have been telling the truth about our politics in our country, and I think that has helped um, to bring along others in political journalism who maybe didn't necessarily understand, right? I mean, I say this a lot because it's something that I realized after I probably really seriously started covering race and politics full time after the 2016 election. And that is that, I mean, I've been doing this, like you said, for a minute. It is, I, having covered both of those topics, like, I know that it is easier to learn how to cover politics than it is to learn how to cover race. And yet, race is the
Yeah.
story of our politics and has been since at least 2008. So anybody who's been
Yes.
practicing journalism for the past decade and a half should be well versed in what race identity politics, and that includes white folks, and racism looks like, and how that shows up in our politics. Like they
Yes.
must understand that, or they're not covering this accurately. Like, this is not about anybody's feelings. This is about leaving the most accurate and honest record behind, which is supposed to be one of the central tenets of journalism, right? Like, race reporting at its best does that. And we're not talking about politics right now unless we are talking about race. And I think that having more Black journalists and especially Black women in the mix, because we know the importance of Black voters, but also women being the majority of the electorate, right? Like it is important to have that intersection looking at this country and writing and reporting on this country.
Right. Yeah, it's not about how people feel. And me and Wes were talking about this last week about how when we start talking about race and we start talking about racism, white people feel like that's the worst possible thing you can ever say to another white person is that they're racist. And we see how that affects the work that they do because they don't want to just outright say that something is racist or someone did something racist because they think it's an
Absolutely.
indictment of someone's character.
And not just and that matters. That matters. It mattered in 2016, right? Like I think that the reason that so many white journalists had a hard time calling out racism when they saw it in the 2016 campaign is because they had friends or family members who subscribed to similar views. They did not think of those people as racist. They thought of them as good people. Racism is an extreme thing. It's tiki torches in Charlottesville, and it's um, you know um, running over protesters. Like it has to be in your face, overt, cross burning in your yard, hood on in your
Yes.
face. Like, that is racism, as opposed to the microaggressions, as opposed to the systemic institutional racism that happens every day, and that is part of our lived experience, right? Um,
Right.
because like our lived experience has been an asset to our journalism, and their
Right.
inability or unwillingness to think about what it means to be a white person in America has been a liability.
Right. We have a perspective that they don't.
Correct.
And it allows us to be more honest about
Correct.
whether or not something is racist.
Correct.
Um,
Or just more honest about America, period. Period.
yes. And that's not subjective, those are just facts. I mean, it's anyway, you know the vibes.
I love it.
So we do have some viewer questions.
Oh, great.
Denise asked, how seriously should we take Kanye West's 2020 presidential bid?
Denise, what you doing? Why are we doing this, Denise? Until I see an FEC filing, Denise, I'm not taking anything serious. That's all I can say about that. Until we have an FEC filing, this is a real.
I feel like it just feels like a stunt to me. Granted, I know that that's what was said about our current president back in 2015.
Well, yeah, but
Um, but
he filed for president, and he came down an escalator and had an announcement. You can't announce that you're running for president on Twitter.
right,
And we know that several state deadlines have passed at this point. Like again,
yes,
FEC filing. I have not um, given one character on Twitter to this conversation, and I will not until I see an FEC filing.
yeah. I mean, I think my short answer to this question is I don't care, so I don't know why anyone else should. All right. And so our next question is from Nisa. I hope I'm saying that correctly. If I'm not, I am so sorry. And you can comment and tell me that my tongue is thick and country and I can't speak right. Um, but they asked, so Biden is the nominee. Sorry, Biden is the nominee. What is he doing to deserve my vote?
Well, I mean, I think that is for you to decide. I mean,
Yeah.
he is certainly running a campaign that he is saying is about a battle for the soul of America. That he's trying to be inclusive. That seems to be a message that is that contrasts that of the president, who is being divisive and using a racial playbook um, to incite his mostly white supporters. But yeah, I mean, I think that is the question that all voters are going to ask themselves headed into November. Has the vice president earned your vote? I mean, I certainly know many people. We know that voter participation in this country is abysmal, and I know that part of the reason for that is because there are so many Americans for whom it really does not matter who is in the White House. That does not change the circumstances of their daily life, and so they have not. They are not people who grew up believing, that voting was essential. Um, the idea that somebody bled and died for them to be able to vote is not something that necessarily resonates with them. And so they do need a reason to vote. And non-voters are, and I'm not saying that that's who you are, Nisa, so please don't take this the wrong way, but they're a constituency to be courted as well. And folks, I think that to think that we are now in a stage of this election where they should be only focused on turnout instead of persuasion would be a mistake. There's so many people.
I think. Well, no, go ahead.
I said there's so many people that need to be persuaded, even though there's a nominee.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about deservedness, that's just such a personal thing. I mean, I just don't know like what a candidate does to deserve my vote is going to be different than what they do to deserve your vote. Like it's like we're just going to care about different things, even if they fall under the same umbrella of like education. Like we might care about different pieces of education. So it's just a very personal thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I will say is that there are the current president is dangerous and creating dangerous conditions in this country for people who are not white. So I think that matters too whenever we start talking about going to the polls. And our last question is from Alicia, and she asks, do you see a generational difference in white journalists on race and calling out racism? It's a good one.
That is a good one. I think because you have younger white journalists who grew up in a more diverse environment in a lot of cases, talking about race may come more easily to some of them than it comes to older white journalists who have not necessarily always um, been used to or comfortable with having those types of conversations. That said,
Mm-hmm.
I know older white people, including white people in journalism, who are among those that are buying up all those books on race right now on Amazon Prime and are trying to catch up, right? Are trying to learn, are trying to do better. Because what you have to remember about those white people also is that, many of them grew up amid a national reckoning on race, right? Many of them were around when the first Black journalists came into a newsroom. And so it's not as if they don't know about the history of this country. Some of them lived it. They just haven't necessarily thought very much about it or thought about their role in it. But then there are others who have. I mean, one of my close friends in this business, Hank Klibanoff, who co-wrote the Race Beat, talked about covering the civil rights movement as a white journalist. There are white folks who, if they have done their work, and that includes white journalists, if they have done the work of interrogating privilege, who are having these conversations and who are doing this reporting. But I think that most white people in America, and that includes white people in the newsroom, are not comfortable talking about race because they do not spend nearly as much time as we do thinking about it.
And that's that on that. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your perspective. And again, you're one of the journalists I admire. So I'm very, very thankful that you came on.
Well, it is a mutual admiration society. Keep up the good work. Keep telling the truth in public. We need you. You matter. I will be reading, and I'll be watching because, yeah, it's all hands on deck out here for this election because I know we didn't expect it to go the way that it's going, but it is an extraordinary
Yeah.
year to be covering nonetheless. And so, I think telling the truth about who and where we are in this moment is on all of us. So thanks
I
everybody for
agree.
watching.
Yes, thank y'all for watching, and I'll be back next week to talk to somebody else. All right, y'all take care.